All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I am your host, Aaron Freeman. And today we are talking about the ways in which presumptive starters Richie Grant and Jaylinn Hawkins will enhance the Falcons defense as we break down this team's safety group.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, or daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And we thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day, of course. Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on your preferred podcast platform, whether that be Apple, Odyssey, Google, or Spotify. And of course, you can check us out on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So, as usual, as we have done all week long, we are breaking down a new position group for the Falcons, talking safeties, and we'll have our big question of the season, talking about whether or not Richie Grant and Jaylinn Hawkins will live up to expectations. Our big question of the summer, talking about where guys like Erik Harris and Dean Marlowe and Teez Tabor, among others, sort of fit in to the competitions here. But we're going to change up the format a little bit today and start things off talking about how Dean Pease is going to utilize these guys. He's going to continue the theme that we've been doing all week long on this podcast, breaking down this defense, with the idea that now kind of Dean Pease has the pieces he needs in order to run a better version of his defense. And we've used the analogy with the offense back in the fall and throughout the offseason, talking about Arthur Smith having a sort of a limited tasted menu as a chef opening up a restaurant. And we haven't really applied that same analogy to the defense. But, the idea was like, okay, if you've gone from 5 items, now you're expanding it to 15, right? Again, we're not the Cheesecake Factory quite yet, but at least now we have steak, chicken, fish, and a vegetarian meal that you can choose from. There's 2 soups on the menu rather than just a simple soup of the day and some chicken tenders or whatever the case may be was on that limited menu. So we're cooking things up as far as Dean Pease is going, and a lot of that is hinged on introducing Richie Grant and Jaylinn Hawkins into the lineup and how they sort of contrast with what the 2 starters last year in Duron, Harmon, and Erik Harris did. Harmon and Harris had complementary skill sets. Harmon was more of a deep guy. Harris, being a former linebacker, was much more comfortable in the box. And that was kind of reflected in how those guys were deployed. If we look at the PFF data, Harris spent about 75% of his snaps lined up deep, with only about 20% in the box. Harmon spent 75% of his snaps lined up deep. Harris lined up all over the place, but spent a considerable amount of time in the box, about 32% in the box, 40% deep, and 28% elsewhere, which was primarily being a slot corner or lining out wide in those man coverage assignments. But I think with Richie Grant and Jaylinn Hawkins, and I think where these two guys differ is that Grant and Hawkins also have complementary skill sets, but it's much more similar to each other. And I think the value that it brings for this Falcons defense is that they're going to be a lot more interchangeable with how Dean Pease deploys them. The Dean Pease is going to be able to do a lot more with disguise pre and post snap because Grant and Hawkins have much more similar skill sets and they can do anything, rather than it being much more where Harmon's primarily the deep guy, Harris is primarily the box guy. I think the other aspect that Grant and Hawkins are going to bring to the table over and be upgrades over Harmon and Harris, which is the expectation that they will be much more effective making plays on the ball. Right, that was something that Harmon and Harris didn't really do a particularly good job. We will probably see Grant and Hawkins, or at least we're hoping to see those guys be able to make more plays on the ball. That's more pass breakups. That's more interceptions. Right. But the flip side of that is while they may be a little bit more aggressive making some of those plays in the ball, they may be due to the fact of their inexperience and their youth, may be prone to giving up more big plays. And that will be an interesting dichotomy with the Falcons defense this year, because last year their greatest strength, when you look at the various aspects in which at least I judge defensive performance, where you're looking at pass rush, you're looking at run defense, you're looking at third down efficiency, red zone efficiency, big plays, either big plays that you're generating for the defense, which is takeaways and turnovers, or big plays that you're preventing the offense from getting, right? Big plays, that latter one was the only one that the Falcons were like top 15 at. They were 13th last year in terms of the fewest number of 20 plus yard plays given up last year. And then the other aspect of their defense that was decent was that the fact that they were decent creating turnovers. They were 20th in the league in terms of total takeaways. And so those are two areas that you want to see this team build upon in their sort of bend but don't break style of defense. But it wouldn't shock me this year if we see those two elements kind of flip flop. And this year they're 13th and creating turnovers and 20th in terms of big plays given up. And I think that's a trade-off that many people would be willing to make. It remains to be seen if Dean Pease is one of those people that is willing to make that trade-off. But we'll just sort of see if these guys can live up to those expectations. And we'll talk about that as we continue today's episode, getting into that big question of the season on whether or not Richie Grant and Jaylinn Hawkins can live up to those expectations, guys. But someone who always lives up to my expectations, that's Brad Rowland, the host of the Locked On Hawks podcast, which you can find on your preferred podcast platform, all the same ones that you're either listening to or watching, Locked On Falcons. So go check out Brad's take on all the latest with the Atlanta Hawks and, their offseason and all that stuff on your preferred podcast platform. And guys, I also want to tell you about Built Bar, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. Built Bar is even better than a candy bar because Built Bars not only taste good, they're good for you because they're low in sugar, calories, and carbs, but high in protein and fiber. If you want to try some limited summertime flavors, you can try some with the toffee almond, which is currently on sale at built.com. You can try the raspberry lemonade. If you love the fluffy, marshmallowy goodness of the puff flavors, you can try the orange dreamsicle puff, the coconut brownie chunk puff, the brownie batter puff. And like all Built Bars, these bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. And whether you want to try those limited time flavors or tried and trues like coconut almond, double chocolate, cookies and cream, cherry barcia, mint brownie, peanut butter brownie, salted caramel, raspberry, and so much more, you can find your favorite or order a mix box to try them all by heading over to built.com. And when you do, use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So guys, before we jump into the question of the season, I do want to let you guys know about a feature that's coming up on the Locked On NFL podcast next week, starting Monday, July 18th. You will get a breakdown with all the local experts breaking down the top 50 most valuable players in the NFL based off of odds makers like BetOnline. So starting Monday, check out Locked On NFL on your preferred podcast platform as well as YouTube. So guys, our question of the season is essentially piggybacking on what we just talked about with the ways that Dean Pease can better utilize these safeties. Will these guys actually in Grant and Hawkins live up to that? And when we're talking about Richie Grant, he had a disappointing rookie season by most accounts. I know I went into last season expecting him to be sort of the day one starter at that safety position next to Duron Harmon over an Erik Harris, and that was not the case. And that created a lot of frustration with the fan base. Obviously I was a little frustrated with that in September, but by the time we got to like January, February, I was mostly fine with Richie Grant's rookie season. I saw progress from him. There were some mental errors early in the season when he got on the field early as that nickel cornerback, but those were mostly eliminated by the time we got to the end of the season. My main issue by the time we got to the end of the season with Richie Grant's performance on the field was the inconsistent tackling. And that was an issue that we thought might be an issue, coming from his days at UCF, since he's not necessarily the biggest guy. And so that reared its ugly head. And, that's a bigger issue to me now with him being more of a permanent safety than it was at nickel cornerback, simply because, corners back missing tackles is a lot more tolerable at those positions because you're primarily being paid to cover guys. Like no one really cares that AJ Terrell misses a ton of tackles all the time, right? But at safety, it's a lot less tolerable, right? Like when a safety misses a tackle, that's usually a 60-yard touchdown. Or what happens. So we'll have to see if Richie Grant can clean those things up. But I'm expecting Richie Grant to primarily be a deep safety for the Falcons. I'm not expecting him to spend 75% of his snaps deep. I'm expecting that maybe to be in the 50-60% range or something like that. We talked about Richie Grant in his scouting report last year that while he can be an effective post safety, and for those of you that don't know what that term means, that's basically a single high safety, playing that deep middle field, center field, I'm sorry. While I think Grant can be effective in that role, I don't think he'll thrive in that role, right? Like that's not really ideally where he would thrive in. Grant's sort of strengths and what we really liked about Richie Grant coming out of UCF was his versatility, was his ability to do multiple things for a defense, whether it's playing deep, whether it's playing the box, whether it's covering the slot, whether it's blitzing, all those various things, right? He's a guy that is a six across the board, right? And that's what his strengths are, is being a solid all-around safety. And that's one of the reasons why we were very optimistic about what he could do in the DMP's defense. Unfortunately, we didn't see him deliver on that last year, but now we're optimistic that he can do so this year. So we'll see how he does there. When it comes to Jaylinn Hawkins and assessing his 2021 as a way to sort of project what he can be in 2022, there were really two phases of Jaylinn Hawkins' performance last year. There was an early phase where when the Falcons, after the Isaiah Oliver injury in week 4, over the next 4 games from weeks 5 to week 9, were primarily using a lot more big nickel when they went to their nickel sets. And it was Erik Harris that was getting the majority of the slot snaps over a Richie Grant during that 4-game stretch. And we saw Jaylinn Hawkins be utilized as sort of the fifth DB, and they would put 3 safeties on the field, with Harris being that slot corner, Harmon being deep, and Hawkins as well playing in the mix. And I thought Hawkins played well in that early phase. That's where both of his interceptions came during that phase of the game, and we saw him, be a lot more consistent there. But then there was a later phase of the season after he dealt with some injuries, but then Erik Harris tore his pectoral, was out for the season. And there were 3 games in the month of December where essentially Hawkins was replacing Harris. And he was, like Harris, was being much more of a box defender during those stretch of games. And I thought Hawkins had a lot more mental errors and mistakes during those games. And so my expectation is this year, with a more full-time role, we will see him be utilized much more closer to what we saw early in the season, where it was a healthy mix of both deep and sort of box responsibilities during that early phase of the season when he was the third safety. It was about 55% of his snaps were deep and 28% were in the box. And I think that's an ideal sort of way for Hawkins to be deployed, because when you go back to his college tape, he was primarily a deep safety there. Right. And then the Falcons, of course, drafted him to be more of a box safety and a backup behind Keanu Neal in the old scheme run by Dan Quinn and Raheem Morris. And I think that was part of the reason why I wasn't necessarily in love with Hawkins as a draft prospect. The Falcons obviously took him in 4th round, and I kind of looked at him as like a late 7th round priority free agent type of prospect, because he didn't really do either one of those things great. Like he spent a lot of his time as a single high or a cover 2 safety at Cal, and he was fine in that role. He's functional, but he wasn't great in that role, and certainly didn't necessarily have the skill set that you thought would thrive more as a box safety. But I think that, what was a weakness in the former scheme, or was a question mark in the former scheme, is actually potentially a strength in this current scheme under Dean Pease. Again, going back to the wanting more of that interchangeability. And so Hawkins' ability to do multiple things may be an asset for him that could lead to his success this upcoming season. So I think for both of these guys, there's reasons for optimism. There's reasons to be skeptical. We just haven't really seen it from either way of these guys. And so essentially, as I sort of see the situation, it's kind of a coin flip, right? Flip a coin. And, if it comes up heads, they'll be good. If it comes up tails, they'll be bad, or vice versa, whichever you prefer. If you're a tails never fails type of person, then, flip it. But I think the good thing about this situation is that that's a 50-50 shot, which means is essentially random. But we're in a situation where we're kind of flipping two coins, where one coin is Richie Grant succeeding, one coin is Jaylinn Hawkins succeeding. And, the odds are one coin turning up heads or tails is 50-50. But, one of these coins is going to turn up the way that we want it. At least the odds are in our favor if we're flipping it twice, right? That we'll get at least one outcome, whether that's heads or tails, that we are looking for. And so that gives me a little bit of optimism that we can find a guy that we can move forward with at least at one of these safety spots by year's end. And it goes back to something we kind of talked about on yesterday's episode, where talking about sort of the Falcons making strides as they sort of quote unquote expand their menu. They're making strides to sort of get these final pieces to the puzzle on the defensive side of the ball. And we haven't gotten there yet. One of those pieces is going to be adding Will Anderson or Jalen Carter at the top of next year's draft. And yeah, guys, if you didn't think I could do it, I did it. The streak continues. We got 6 days in a row where I've mentioned Will Anderson or Jalen Carter as a future Falcon on the podcast. We'll see if I can continue it next week. It's going to be a lot harder to talk about that when we get to special teams breakdown next Monday, as well as other topics, but we'll see. One of the things, in addition to that sort of being a big piece moving forward for the Falcons defense, these final puzzle pieces, another one was potentially, that I mentioned on yesterday's cornerback breakdown, was a potential starting safety. And so that gets to what we're talking about, where if one of these guys can emerge as a long-term asset, then the Falcons will now finally have the cap space and the flexibility to go out there and get the other guy, rather than having to rely on these sort of cheap veterans like Duron, Harmon, and Erik Harris and Marlowe these last two off seasons. And like the last couple of off seasons, there should be plenty of a quality veteran and young up and coming safeties that hit the open market, so the Falcons will have their options. So, moving forward with the safety position, because of that, like, this is really a make or break year for both Richie Grant and Jaylinn Hawkins. That this year is a golden opportunity for these guys to show that they are not just role players, but these are guys that can be long-term starters here in Atlanta, because I don't know if they're going to get another opportunity in the future, is kind of the point I'm going to sit here and say, is that if the Falcons feel like they can get better safety play, nothing's really going to stop them from going out there and getting that next offseason. So this is kind of their one shot to show what they have, and hopefully we'll see if they can do so. I think I'm quasi optimistic at this point in time, but part of the reason why I'm only quasi optimistic is, I was very optimistic, this time last year, that Richie Grant would be the week 1 starter for the Falcons. That did not necessarily prove to be the case. So that gives me some skepticism, some tepidness when it comes to making any bold proclamations. But I do feel like moving forward, I feel good about at least the momentum that these guys have moving forward this season. We'll sort of see how it all plays out. But we'll sort of wrap up today's episode talking about sort of the big question of the summer, and that's going to be talking about the other safeties and where they sort of fit in the mix behind Richie Grant, or potentially challenging Grant and Hawkins this summer for starting jobs. And we'll talk about the veterans like Erik Harris and Marlowe, as well as Teez Tabor, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But before we get there, I want to tell you about the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info, and that's, of course, BetOnline.net. Whether you're looking for the latest odds, contests, or player props, BetOnline has it all. And of course, you can bet on Major League Baseball, you can bet on boxing, esports, UFC, Vegas casino games. If you want to put in your futures bets for the NFL, the NBA, NHL, who's going to win the Stanley Cup next year, who's going to be the NBA MVP, you can put in a prop bet for Drake London being Offensive Rookie of the Year, or Marcus Mariota Comeback Player of the Year. Whatever you want, head on over to the website at betonline.net to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. So, guys, I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. And of course, we are now wrapping up the safety position. So we are wrapping up the defense, and that leaves just one more position group, the most important position group, the one that truly matters. And that is, of course, special teams, which we will be breaking down on Sunday. If you're checking us out on YouTube on at Sunday evening, or if you're checking out Locked On Falcons on your preferred podcast audio platform, you'll hear it on Monday. So make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on your preferred podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube to get the special teams breakdown a little bit earlier. So make sure you hit that like, make sure you hit that bell on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. So that gives us to our last question of the defense and our question of the summer, which is sort of where do the rest of the safeties fit in if we're assuming Richie Grant and Jaylinn Hawkins are going to be the guys at this position, which isn't necessarily a guaranteed assumption because, you have veterans like Erik Harris, you have guys like Dean Marlowe who have a lot more starting experience and playing time experience than, Grant and Hawkins both have. And so that gives the Falcons some decent insurance options that in the event that Dean Pease sticks with more of a conservative mindset of having guys out there that do their job and don't make those mental mistakes, Harris and Marlowe might be more his speed in that regard. And Harris, especially, that was kind of the strength of Erik Harris last year. This is unofficially a pro Erik Harris podcast because he kind of embodied the do your job mantra. Now, did he do his job particularly well? Not really, but he was probably like a 5 out of 10 player. And he doesn't get enough respect largely due to splash play syndrome, which is something I've talked about before, where most fans judge, who's good and who's bad based off of the number of splash plays they do or don't make versus the vast majority. Erik Harris played like 700 plus snaps, but his season to a lot of fans is based off of 6 plays he did or did not make. And so I think that's part of the reason why there is a generally negative perception of Erik Harris, which is fine. Again, watching on TV, you're not going to be able to really see what the safeties are doing on film. That's one of the benefit of watching film, and that's part of the reason why, I'm a film snob, as it were. But I think Erik Harris is solid. We know what he can do in the scheme. Even if we know that he isn't doing that at a high level. As for Dean Marlowe, he's an interesting addition to essentially come in and fill Duron Harmon's shoes and potentially be probably the biggest challenger to Richie Grant this season as that guy that's primarily a deep safety first and foremost. And Marlowe's interesting background because he was a dime safety in Buffalo for 2 years in 2019 and 2020, then signed with the Lions last year. And from what I've read, the primary factor in why he wanted to go to Detroit was that they played a lot more of those split safety coverages, and he would be allowed to play a lot more deep stuff in Detroit than he did in Buffalo, where in one of those years as the dime safety, he was kind of a glorified box safety. And then one in those other years, he was kind of essentially a glorified nickel cornerback in those years. And so in Detroit, at least he represents being a true safety. And the expectation is here in Atlanta, it would be the same case if he gets on the field. So we'll see how much those guys are in the mix at the safety position. I do expect to see some of those guys. We know Dean Pease generally will try to find a role for a third safety at some point in time, and we'll just sort of see it. My guess is Harris would be the first man up in that regard, but we'll sort of see what Marlowe can do and if he can push for time. But I think for the most part, while there's a chance again that Dean Pease may want the sort of more known commodities in the veterans, I think he'll go more in favor of the youth. But those guys in Marlowe and Harris can be solid depth for the Falcons this year. As for the rest of the safety room, you have Teez, Tabor, and undrafted free agent Trey Webb, who was a teammate of Troy Anderson at Montana State. And I've seen Tabor on a number of people's 53-man roster projections. He's not on mine. I'm currently projecting the Falcons to only keep 4 safeties on the roster. Tabor would be presumably the 5th guy. And the main reason why I'm not putting Tabor on my 53-man roster projection is due to the fact that I don't see what exactly his role is going to be on special teams. The knock on Tabor, and one of the reasons why he did not work out as a second-round corner for the Lions several years ago is he doesn't necessarily have speed, and that means that he's probably not going to be a gunner on the punt team. And then he's too small to sort of line up on the line of scrimmage on the punt team. Although Richie Grant is not bigger than him, and he also lined up on the line of scrimmage. But I think there were certain circumstances that led to the Falcons being like, we got to get something out of Richie Grant. He's a second-round pick. They're not going to do that out of Teez Tabor, in my humble opinion. Maybe the Lions would have done it because he was a second-round pick for them, but not for the Falcons. So I have a hard time sort of seeing Teez Tabor having a regular role on Sundays. And so therefore, to me, instead of being a roster player, he's much more likely to be a practice squad player. And if we're talking practice squad, I'm much more intrigued by the younger guy in Trey Webb than the 26-year-old Teez Tabor, who's kind of been there, done that. When I was watching Montana State to watch Troy Anderson, Webb would pop and flash from time to time. I'm like, who's that guy? Right. My eyes would kind of veer over to what he was doing, trying to keep an eye on him at times as well. And so he was able to come in on a tryout basis, impress the coaching staff enough in the month of May at those rookie mini camps to earn a roster spot to be on the 90-man roster. And so if he can continue to do that in July and August, then I do think he's potentially a front runner to be on the practice squad. So that's why, my unofficial projection would have Webb on the practice squad over someone like a Teez Tabor. But we'll see how that plays out this summer, guys, and we'll see how the safety group plays out for the rest of the season. Obviously, again, as I said at the top, this is kind of a make or break year for guys like Grant and Hawkins, because I don't know if the team is going to have sort of the patience to let these guys develop over the course of 3 or 4 years or whatever the case may be. Well, obviously not with Hawkins because he's only got 2 more years left on his contract, but you get what I'm saying. So it'll be interesting to see how these guys look this summer. It'll be interesting to see how these guys look this season. A lot of potential here, but a lot more unknowns at the safety position compared to most of the rest of the defense. So this is kind of an X factor. If you're, particularly optimistic about this defense this year, then you're probably optimistic that Grant and Hawkins can hit the ground running this season. If you still have some skepticism, you may be looking at this position like, I don't really know. Because again, last year, we all were excited about what Richie Grant would be able to do right off the bat, and then that did not necessarily come to fruition. So we'll see how it all plays out, guys, and we'll see how it plays out for the special teams on Sunday evening on YouTube here on Locked On Falcons, or Monday morning on Apple, Odyssey, Google, or Spotify on Locked On Falcons. And guys, I also want to let you know about Locked On NFL, in addition to checking out Locked On NFL next week to get the top 50 breakdowns of the top 50 NFL players. Why not check out Locked On NFL today as your second listen after you've made Locked On Falcons your first listen to get all the lowdown on the other 31 NFL teams around the NFL, guys. So that's going to do it for us here, guys. Really appreciate you tuning in for another episode. I hope you have a great week. And I want to give some love to, who was it? I think it was Clem Frico. Who said, wanted me to mention that July 14th, as I'm recording this, is, I think, National Day in France, is what I'm guessing. So he wanted me to say something about it on today's podcast. So, I got to give the people, or at least the person, what he wants. So shout out to the European and French listeners, all 6 of you, checking out the podcast over there in France. Such a lovely country. I did go there in my youth for 1 week in high school. So great place to be. Lots of delicious bread. And, had I been old enough to drink the wine, I probably would have enjoyed that as well. But I was not old enough at the time. So, great National Day there in France. So there's your shout out, Clem. So really, guys, appreciate it. Hope you have a great weekend. I hope you stay cool, stay dry, or whatever the case may be. I know I'm going to try to grill this weekend, but I know it's going to be raining on and off this weekend. So we'll see if I can sort of figure out how to dodge that. So I hope you guys have a great weekend. Appreciate it. Till then.